It's important for us to continue to grow and understand our own ego states and which we have access to and which we don't. And the thing that I want to talk about is that sometimes decision-making can be difficult because, as Van was alluding to, we aren't accessing all three and taking the time to explore what's in each ego state and to use the adult to then decide, right? So when we don't do that, we may be operating out, there are two things that we call ego state dysfunction. And one is this contamination, and then I'm going to talk about exclusion. So these would be barriers to doing the problem solving in the effective way. Contamination is, there's 3 ways that contamination can happen. One is the contamination of the adult ego state by the parent ego state. So that we would, in that particular kind of contamination, we present as a fact what is really an opinion. And if you have, and we've made this direct link, and that's called a prejudice. And we've made the direct link to that in terms of social issues because often we are taught things that actually are oppressive as if they were facts. So there is information that there are larger numbers of black and brown men in prison. Some people who don't understand how that happens might say that's because they're not as smart or not as good. So that would be a parent-adult contamination because they're not safe or they're bad people or they're inferior in some way, right? So that would be a parent-adult contamination. What is really an opinion? It was an opinion or a misinformation, we call it in our model. So I have an article in a TA journal called Modern Racism, a TA perspective, which uses this model to talk about different ways in which contamination can happen with respect to race. And it can happen on any of so gay people are going to go to hell. That would be a parent-adult contamination, right? And what we know is that often any parent-adult contamination that's based on strictly a cognitive misinformation will change if we get facts. So one example we used to use in the TA 101 is people used to think the world was flat because they could only travel so far. And as they began to get new information and realizing that that was misinformation, the maps changed. So that's an easy, changing parent-adult contamination can be done by giving people new information. Does that make sense? And the second kind of contamination is presenting as fact what is really a decision based on feelings. So it's contamination of the adult by the child ego state. So if I was taught that black and brown men are inferior and are in jail because of that, I might also have caught black men are scary. And black men are scary would be a child-adult contamination because I have made a decision based on a magical thinking, which would be from that P1 that we talked about. So child-adult contamination is where I have had an experience or some misinformation that I have internalized and decided was a fact based on feelings. And what we know about child-adult contamination is that it only changes with the repeated corrective emotional experiences. And so we might have one experience that you can say, oh, that was the outlier. But so it's repeated corrective emotional experiences. And what we also know is that if a parent-adult contamination doesn't change with new information, we are likely dealing with actually a child-adult contamination. And decision-making is really difficult from either of those places. You could see that, right? So I'm thinking about the Tesla, the car example, and thinking about the cultural conversation that's happening about do we have an environmental crisis in this country, right? So I would say it's child-adult contamination to believe that the humans aren't affecting the earth. Would anybody disagree with that in this room? That's how we do this in the workshop. If that's a cultural, to the extent that some of the folks who are pushing that have a child contamination, that humans don't do that. You see, that's going to only change. I mean, hopefully we will be able to interrupt the destruction that will happen if we don't address that child-adult contamination. But that's why I'd say the stakes are higher on some of these child-adult contaminations right now. And that's an example that came to mind as we were talking about the Tesla. So wrestling with environmental I mean, this is my opinion. If we didn't have so much child-adult contamination around this, we would have had electric cars 20 years ago. And we don't have them, and we're still fighting it. So just, I won't get off on that too much, but that's an example of how we apply this to a social lens. The third kind of contamination would be a double one, where I have both parent-adult contamination and child-adult contamination. So I'm actually, my adult ego state is compromised in terms of making decisions based on current reality, because I'm operating on both my assumptions, unprocessed and undiagnosed assumptions, unexplored assumptions, as well as on decisions made from a feeling place that impact my thinking. Anything else y'all think that? So that's contamination. And again, for those of you who are interested in this, we've been using the word misinformation as a way to invite folks to not feel it as a shame thing, because we catch it, as we've been talking about. So just another language. The other kind of ego state dysfunction. Oh, yes, Lena.
Valerie, real quick, could you give an example of the third form of contamination, the double?
The double contamination?
Well, I was thinking at the personal level, children will often get negative messages like you're lazy or you're just stupid. And so that's the parent-adult contamination if he takes it in. And then the child-adult contamination is I'm stupid, and therefore go through the life with those double contaminations at the personal level.
Yeah, that may be, I was thinking about how that might relate. I mean, I don't know how, how then does the child feel good about themselves if they're getting the message that you need to be humble? What contaminations might result from that?
I just had a quick question about the child contamination, actually the parent contamination as well. When dealing with patients with psychosis, I know you mentioned with the child contamination, there's the magical parent. Is that where delusions derive? And if so, then is the parent contamination, would that be more if you see patients with, say, hallucinations? Or is that too much?
I think both of those come from the child, hallucinations and...
The hallucinations and delusions.
Prejudice comes from the parent.
But also women in our society, and somebody was asking last night, do you think we're ready for a woman president? And there's so much about women that we have contaminated from our parent in terms of their place, and then women themselves have been struggling with my place in society. So those double contaminations work both at the personal level and at the institutional, social, and cultural level.
Gordon Allport, in his book Nature of Prejudice, which was published in the 1950s, talks about prejudice that's caught and taught. So I was just wondering, the prejudice that's caught might theoretically fit as a child-adult contamination, because it's just caught. And if it's taught, even if it's taught indirectly, it's more, theoretically at least, parent-adult contamination. Because I think we've got so many prejudices that fit both those categories.
So exclusion is when, and this has been alluded to, when we don't have access to all three because one of them is excluded, essentially not available to us. And so the first one would be exclusion of the child, and I thought you gave a great example of that initially, Van, as you talk about if I grew up in a family that was abusive, I may have shut out my feelings as a way to survive. So I would have excluded my emotions. And the work then is to reclaim access to that so that I can get my wants and needs met, because wants and needs are in the child ego state. Right? So that's the exclusion of the child. The other way would be exclusion of the parent, where I don't have access to rules for how to be in the world. So this particular one would render me struggling with how to take care of myself, right? And how to be available for others. So I might be a good thinker, and I might have a lot of feelings, and I might not be doing very well in terms of self-care. And then the third one would be where I exclude my thinking. So I have a lot of judgments and opinions and values, and I have a lot of emotions, and I don't have a way of filtering that. So that, I think, is the place where you might define that as psychotic or because there's no access to current reality. So we all have those moments, and people who get that diagnosis live in that state more often than not.
Can you say that again?
That people who live in, if I am excluding my thinking, the thinking part of myself, then I'm living in my judgments and in my emotions, and I'm not in tune with reality. I was in Oakland a few weeks back, and I was listening to a guy who has a mental illness who was on the street exhibiting lots of parent information, talking from the Bible, and also expressing a lot of emotions, and wasn't in touch with what was happening today. So that he was in a psychotic state at that point, right? Doesn't mean that it can't be accessed, but that's his normative state.
Can you say the child one more time?
The exclusion of the child is the story about someone who grew up in a family in which there was abuse and it was painful, and they shut off their feelings as a way to survive. So they might become very cognitive or very caretaking of others, and codependency might be an example. Codependency is also an example there. Yeah.
I was wondering about the double contamination of exclusion of the adult excluding both parent and child. And I worked a lot with engineers and scientists where they really concentrate on facts and measurable content, and shoulds and rules don't matter that much. Well, rules would, but certainly child doesn't. And so I was thinking of that kind of a double exclusion of both parent and child, and functioning only trusting the adult ego state.
I see. I did it wrong.
Well,
It's both ways.
It's
It
both
can,
ways.
yeah.
Go both ways. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
This is Spock on Star Trek, would be an example of that.
Yes. So they're talking about the way that if you just stay an adult the whole time, right? And I was talking about the way that you exclude the adult the other way, and it can happen both ways.
I wonder if we could go back to the healthy decision-making, or I can't remember the adjective on that first slide, and I wonder if you could describe that one more time.
Listen to what the parent messages are about a decision that you want to make, and then you listen to what your feelings are about that decision, and then you use your adult to weigh that information and
You
decide.
take in the factual information as well, and then you use all three to come up with a decision that fits reality and satisfies all three ego states.
Okay, so the arrows going to the horizontal arrows are using your reasoning and facts? Is that what the horizontal arrows are?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
right.
I want to make sense of this on a cultural level as it relates to white supremacy and whiteness, and I'm wondering, is white supremacy an exclusion of all three of these?
So white supremacy culture teaches that whiteness and white people's ways are best. It teaches it directly and indirectly. And so it's a parent-adult contamination and a child-adult contamination. I mean, and this new work that's coming out about white fragility is exposing the child-adult contamination. Underneath all the superiority is this sense of fragility about what is the world if I don't control it. That would be child-adult contamination. So I think the contamination is what's relevant for that.
It's really the fear in the child that drives the behavior.
and this is the problem. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering, though, still on the exclusion side, and I know it's a generalization, but if you look at, the collective of white people and how that group of people relates to itself in unhealthy ways, that's where I'm wondering if white people as a group, I know I'm oversimplifying, but if white people as a group actually are not in touch with, we've repressed I'm not sure which of the ego states. That's what I'm trying to think through. But if you think it doesn't belong there, maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
If we talk about this systemically, which you're doing, it's not about the individual.
Right. I'm not talking about individuals.
Exactly. And it's such a persistent systemic problem that we have to address it that way. We cannot reduce it to ego states or to any individualistic theory or transactional theory at one-to-one. Then when you try to work with it in society, where do you begin? How do we start? Where do we start? And what do we do next after that? And you can, I don't know, but I suspect that white supremacy, if it doesn't get corrected, is going to do us in.